Night I turned 19, I was in a hospital bed with 3 broken ribs, a punctured lung, and a note in my chart that said my mother had been contacted. She never came. I found that out later. At the time, I was unconscious for most of it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, because the accident wasn't where the story really starts. It started years before that, in a house where I learned that some people's love has a price tag, and I wasn't worth the cost. My name is Brendan. I'm 31 now. I work in civil engineering. I have a dog named Biscuit who destroys every shoe I own, and I have a grandfather named Walter who, at 78 years old, is still the toughest person I've ever met. I want you to remember his name. He matters more than anyone else in this story. My mother's name is Renata. She remarried when I was 8. My stepfather's name is Glenn. They have 2 daughters together, twins Cassie and Dana, now in their early 20s. Growing up, the 4 of them were a unit. I was the thing that came with the house when Glenn moved in, the leftover from Renata's first marriage to my father, who died in a construction accident when I was 5. Too young to remember much. Old enough to feel his absence every single day. I don't want to make this sound like a sad movie. It wasn't dramatic all the time. It was quieter than that. Glenn never hit me. Renata never screamed. It was more like I was invisible. Cassie and Dana had dance recitals that filled entire weekends. My track meets were never on anyone's calendar. My birthday was usually remembered around dinner time, when someone would say, "Oh, isn't today your?" and then trail off. Christmas mornings had a rhythm. The twins got stacks of boxes. I got 2 or 3 things that felt like they'd been grabbed last minute, which they probably had. The one constant in my life was my grandfather. My father's father. Walter. He lived 40 minutes away in a small house with a workshop in the garage where he spent most of his time building furniture. He smelled like sawdust and coffee, and he called me kid. Even when I was 17, every other weekend, Renata would drop me off, and I would spend 2 days feeling like a normal person. We'd work on projects in the garage. He'd teach me how to read blueprints, how to measure twice and cut once. He'd make chili on Sunday afternoons, and we'd watch whatever game was on. And he'd ask me about school like he actually wanted to know the answer. He was the only person who did. When I was 12, I overheard Renata and Glenn talking in the kitchen. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I'd come down for water. The kitchen light was on and their voices carried. "Walter keeps calling," Glenn said. "I know," my mother said. "You could just let the kids spend more time over there. I'm not shipping him off like he's a problem." There was a pause. Then Glenn said, "Well, he kind of is." Silence. My mother didn't argue. I went back upstairs without the water. I never told Walter about that conversation, but I started paying closer attention after that, watching the way Renata looked at me sometimes, not with cruelty exactly, more like inconvenience, like I was a traffic delay she hadn't planned for. I did well in school, not because anyone pushed me, but because it was the one place I felt like I controlled something. I ran track, I got decent grades, I stayed out of the way at home, I learned to want as little as possible from people who couldn't give it. The summer before my senior year, Walter took me on a camping trip to a state park about 2 hours north. 3 days. Just the 2 of us. No cell service. On the last morning, sitting by the fire with instant coffee, he looked at me and said, "You know you can always come to me. Whatever happens. You know that, right?" I said, "Yeah." "I mean it, Brendan. Whatever happens." I thought he was just being sentimental. He was getting older. People got sentimental. I had no idea what he was actually preparing me for. My 19th birthday fell on a Saturday in late September. I was a freshman at a state school, about an hour from home, close enough to come back for breaks, far enough to breathe. I was doing fine. Better than fine, actually. I had a roommate named Pete who became one of my best friends. I had a spot at the library where I liked to study. I had a routine. The birthday call from home came at 6:47 p.m. It was Renata. She said happy birthday, asked if I was eating enough, told me Cassie had gotten a new car. That was a conversation. 4 minutes, then she had to go because dinner was ready. My grandfather called at 7:15. He talked to me for an hour. He asked about my classes, my roommate, whether I'd found a good running trail near campus. He told me he was almost done building a bookshelf he'd been working on for 3 weeks. At the end, he said, "I'm proud of you, kid. genuinely proud. I hung up and sat there for a while. Pete knocked on the door and said some guys from our floor were going to a birthday thing at a house off campus. Nothing crazy. Pizza, some people, someone had a guitar. I wasn't a big party person, but I said okay, because it was my birthday and I figured I should at least try. The house was about 1.5 miles from campus. I drove my car, a 10-year-old Honda that Walter had helped me buy the previous spring. The party was fine. Exactly what Pete had described. 15 or 20 people, bad lighting. Someone playing guitar in the corner, pizza boxes stacked on the kitchen counter. I had 2 beers over 3 hours. I was not drunk. I want to be clear about that because it matters later. I was completely sober when I left at 11:30. It was raining, not hard but steady. The kind of rain that makes roads slick without looking dangerous. I was about half a mile from campus when the car in front of me stopped short. I don't know why, I never found out. I hit the brakes and my car didn't respond the way it should have. The back end swung left. I overcorrected. The Honda went off the right side of the road and down an embankment, hit a concrete drainage barrier, and rolled. I remember the sound. I remember my window shattering. I remember a pain in my chest, so immediate and total that I thought I'd been hit with something. Then, nothing. I woke up in the emergency room. There were lights and voices, and someone was cutting my shirt off, and I tried to ask what was happening, but no sound came out. A nurse leaned close and said I'd been in a car accident, that I was at St. Ansgar Medical Center, that they were taking care of me. She said it slowly and clearly, like she'd said it hundreds of times before. I learned later what had happened in the 4 hours I was unconscious. A driver who'd been behind me saw the crash and called 911. Paramedics got to me in 11 minutes. By the time I reached the ER, the attending physician had determined I had 3 broken ribs, a pneumothorax, collapsed lung, lacerations on my left arm and face, and a likely concussion. The lung was the immediate problem. They needed to perform a procedure to reinflate it, and because I was 19 at the time, technically an adult, they didn't need anyone's consent but mine, except I was unconscious. In situations like that, the hospital has protocols. They attempted to contact my emergency contact, my listed emergency contact. For the form I'd filled out at the campus health center 3 weeks into freshman year, was my mother, Renata. They called her at 11:52 p.m. She answered. The attending physician explained the situation. Her son had been in a serious car accident. He was unconscious. He had a collapsed lung. They needed verbal authorization to proceed with an emergency procedure, according to the nurse who was in the room during the call, and who told me this directly months later because I asked. My mother's response was this: how serious is serious? The doctor said very serious. Potentially life-threatening without intervention. My mother said, he's 19. He's an adult. He signed his own forms. Why are you calling me? The doctor explained again that I was unconscious and couldn't consent. There was a pause on the line. Then my mother said, well, do what you have to do. I can't drive in this weather. Call me when he's awake. And she hung up. The nurse said she stood there for a second after the call ended. Just stood there. The doctor proceeded with the emergency procedure under implied consent standard protocol when a patient is incapacitated and cannot speak for themselves. They stabilized me. It took about 40 minutes. By 1 a.m., I was in a recovery room, unconscious but stable. My mother did not come that night. She did not come the next morning. She texted the hospital at 9:17 a.m. to ask for an update on my condition. They gave it to her. She replied, okay, thanks. The person who walked into my hospital room when I opened my eyes for the first time was my grandfather. Walter was sitting in the chair beside my bed, still wearing his coat, holding a coffee cup from the vending machine down the hall. His hair was uncombed. His eyes were red at the edges. When I looked at him, he leaned forward and said, very quietly, hey kid, I got here as fast as I could. I tried to talk and my chest screamed. He shook his head. Don't. Just rest. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. I didn't ask about my mother. Not right then. I think somewhere. I already knew. I was in the hospital for 6 days. Walter came every single one of them. He drove 40 minutes each way, twice a day, for the first 3 days. He brought me things. A phone charger, a crossword puzzle book, the specific kind of crackers I'd liked since I was a kid that he'd tracked down at a grocery store near the hospital. He sat with me through the boring hours, which in a hospital are most of them. My mother came once. Day 4. She brought Cassie and Dana with her, which I thought was strange, but didn't say anything about. She hugged me carefully, told me I looked terrible, asked if I needed anything, and then spent most of the visit on her phone while Cassie and Dana took selfies near the window. They stayed for 45 minutes. When they left, Renata patted my hand and said, "You're tough. You'll be fine." She didn't come back after that. On day 5, a hospital social worker named Ms. Faraday stopped by my room. She was a small woman in her 50s, with very direct eyes, and she asked me a series of questions that felt routine until they didn't, about my living situation, my support system, whether I had people I could rely on during recovery. I answered honestly. When she left, I asked Walter, who'd been in the room the whole time, whether that conversation was normal. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Brendan, I need to tell you something." When the hospital had called my mother on the night of the accident, she'd said what she said and hung up. Standard procedure after that, the hospital had a secondary contact list. My grandfather. They called Walter at 12:04 a.m. He'd been in his car by 12:09. He'd driven the 40-plus miles to the hospital in 41 minutes, on wet roads in the middle of the night. Which is not something I recommend, but it's the kind of thing Walter did. When he arrived, I was already stabilized and in recovery. A nurse briefed him on my condition, and then a hospital administrator had a brief conversation with him. The kind of conversation they apparently have in situations where the listed emergency contact has declined to assist and a secondary contact has physically arrived at the facility at midnight. I told him I was staying, Walter said, and that I wanted to make sure you had someone to make decisions if you needed it. He paused. He set down his coffee cup. So I called a lawyer I know, that night, from the waiting room, and we started paperwork. I didn't fully understand what he meant. I asked him to explain. What Walter had done, quietly, without telling me, while I was unconscious in a hospital bed, was initiate the process of establishing himself as my emergency medical proxy and temporary legal advocate. Because I was 19, the legal mechanisms were different than they would have been if I were a minor. But what Walter had done was ensure that if anything happened, if I needed further procedures, if decisions needed to be made, he would be the person making them, not Renata. Did she know? I asked. She was notified, he said. What did she say? He looked at me for a long moment. She said that was fine. That was fine. I stared at the ceiling for a while after that. There was a water stain up there shaped like nothing in particular. I looked at it for a long time. I want you to know, Walter said, that I'm not telling you this to make you angry. I'm telling you because you deserve to know what happened. I know, I said, and I'm telling you because things are going to change. If you want them to. There are some options in front of you now, and they're yours to take or leave. That was how Walter told me about things. Always options. Always yours to take or leave. Never pushing. I told him I wanted to hear all of them. Recovery took longer than I expected. The ribs were the worst. There's nothing to do for broken ribs except wait and breathe carefully and be annoyed. The lung improved faster. I was discharged on day 6 with a list of instructions, a follow-up appointment, and a prescription for pain medication I'd need for the next few weeks. Walter took me back to his house, not mine. Not the house in Millbrook where Renata and Glenn and the twins lived. His house. The small one with the workshop in the garage. He'd set up the guest room with an extra pillow and a glass of water on the nightstand and the crossword puzzle book from the hospital. I called my roommate Pete and explained the situation. He said he'd cover for me with our professors and grab my stuff from the dorm. He was a good person. He still is. The first week was just pain and sleep. The second week I started being able to move around without wincing at every breath. I sat in Walter's garage in the afternoons and watched him work on a new project. A rocking chair. He narrated what he was doing as he went, the way he'd always done when I was a kid. It was normal. It was quiet. It was the first time since the accident that I felt like something might actually be okay. Renata called once, on day 9. Asked how I was feeling. Asked if I needed anything. I said I was fine. She said good. And that she was glad Walter was helping out, and that I should rest. The call lasted 6 minutes. She didn't ask to come see me. I didn't ask her to. The lawyer Walter had called the night of the accident was a man named Richard Park, mid-50s, patient, methodical. He came to the house in week 3 and sat with us at the kitchen table with a folder of documents and walked me through what had happened and what my options were. What Walter had done at the hospital had given me time and protection in an emergency, but there was a larger picture now. Richard laid it out carefully. There was a question of the accident itself, insurance, liability, the condition of the road, the other driver. That was one track. There was the question of my long-term well-being, who was in my life, who wasn't, what structures existed or didn't exist. That was another track. And then Richard said something that I hadn't expected. He said he'd done some research, at Walter's request, into my status on my mother's various accounts. Insurance primarily. Health insurance, since I was 19 and still technically eligible to be on her plan. I had been removed from the plan 4 months earlier. I hadn't known. I had a card in my wallet from the previous plan year, and had never checked whether it was still current. I'd been uninsured when the accident happened. The hospital bills, 6 days, emergency procedures, specialists, were going to land on me personally. I sat with that for a moment. When was I removed? I asked. Richard told me the date. It was 3 weeks after Glenn had gotten a new job with better family benefits. The family plan had been upgraded. I had not been included in the upgrade. Was it intentional? I asked. Richard said he couldn't say that for certain. Walter, sitting across from me, didn't say anything. He just looked at me steadily, the way he did when he was letting me work through something on my own. What are the options? I asked. Richard explained. We could pursue the other driver's insurance for the accident. We could pursue the road conditions. There had been reported drainage issues in that area, something the county had been notified about twice. We could also look at whether the removal from the health insurance plan, combined with the documentation of what had happened the night of the accident, constituted a pattern that warranted further legal attention. I want to do all of it, I said. Walter nodded once. I'm going to tell you what happened over the next 8 months, because you deserve to know the whole thing. The road conditions case was the strongest one. The county had received 2 formal complaints about that drainage barrier and the runoff issue that caused standing water on that stretch of road after rain. A third driver had gone off in a similar spot 14 months earlier. Richard filed on my behalf. It took a long time, and it wasn't dramatic. It was a lot of documents and depositions and waiting, but eventually the county's insurance reached a settlement. It covered my hospital bills with a significant amount left over. The other driver's insurance covered vehicle replacement. The health insurance issue was harder. Legally, a parent is not required to keep an adult child on their insurance plan. But what Richard found, during discovery in the county case, was an email chain between Glenn and Renata from the month I was removed. Glenn had asked whether they should keep me on the upgraded plan. Renata had written back, I don't think we need to. He's basically on his own now anyway. That email didn't create a legal case on its own, but Richard presented it, along with the documentation of the night of the accident, to a family court judge in the context of a separate motion. It didn't result in a judgment against Renata, but it created a record. And records have a way of mattering later. What actually changed my life was not the legal outcome. It was simpler than that. Walter asked me, about 4 months into my recovery, whether I'd thought about what I wanted the rest of my life to look like. Not the legal stuff, the actual life. I told him I'd thought about it constantly. He asked what I decided. I said I wanted to transfer schools. The school I'd been at was fine, but it wasn't the right program. I wanted civil engineering. There was a better program 2 states away that I'd looked at before and talked myself out of, for reasons that, in retrospect, were mostly about trying to stay close enough for Renata to theoretically be present. Walter said, then transfer. I said it was expensive, out-of-state tuition, new city, starting over. He said, let me worry about that part. I started to argue, and he held up one hand. I've been putting money away since you were born, he said. Your father made me promise, it's yours. I've just been waiting for you to need it. I didn't say anything for a long time. He told you to do that? I said finally. He said whatever happens, make sure Brendan has a shot. So I did. He shrugged, like it was nothing, like it hadn't been 14 years of quiet, faithful keeping of her promise. You've got a shot now if you want it. Do you want it? I said yes. I transferred the following fall. The program was harder than anything I'd done before, which is the way I wanted it. I graduated in 3 years instead of 4. I got a job with a firm in the city. I have an apartment I pay for myself, a truck I bought with my own money, and the dog Biscuit, who has eaten 2 left shoes in the past month and shows no remorse. Renata and I are not close. We're not estranged, exactly. She texts on my birthday, I call it Christmas. But the relationship is what it is. The night of the accident changed nothing for her as far as I can tell. She doesn't know about most of the legal proceedings. She doesn't know about the email that ended up in a court document. She doesn't know what Walter told me about that night. About the call. About what she said. About the 11 minutes between my grandfather's phone ringing and him getting in the car. Glenn is still Glenn. The twins are doing their lives. I don't hold anything against Cassie and Dana. They were kids too, in their own way. What I do hold on to is this. A few weeks ago, Walter came to visit me in the city for the first time. I took him to a restaurant I like, and we had a long dinner and talked about his rocking chair project, which he finally finished, and about a potential job opportunity I was considering, and about some baseball, and about nothing in particular. Walking back to my apartment afterward, he said, "You did this. You know that, right? I just handled some paperwork." "You drove 40 miles in the rain at midnight," I said. 43, he said. I checked. I laughed. He laughed. He laughed. We walked the rest of the way in the kind of quiet that doesn't need to be filled. At the door, before he went back to his hotel, he gripped my shoulder in that way he had, firm, brief, the way men of his generation showed the things they meant most. "Your father would have been proud of you," he said. I know that for a fact. I waited until he was around the corner before I let myself react to that. I'm 31 years old. I know now that some people are not capable of being what you need them to be. That's not a revelation or a wound anymore. It's just a fact, like the weather, like gravity. You work around it. You find the people who show up and you hold on to them. My grandfather showed up. He drove 43 miles in the rain to sit in a hospital waiting room because I was his. And he was going to make sure I knew it. That's the whole story. That's all of it. I've thought a lot about what actually caused everything that happened. Not the accident, not the rain, not the road. The cause was years older than any of that. Renata made choices. Small ones, mostly. Not putting my track meets on the calendar. Not including me in the insurance upgrade. Answering a hospital call at midnight and deciding that wet roads were a reasonable excuse to stay home. None of those felt like enormous decisions to her, I think. They probably felt like nothing at all. That's the thing about indifference. It doesn't announce itself. It just quietly stacks up year after year, until one night it's midnight and your son is unconscious and you say, "Call me when he's awake," and hang up the phone and go back to sleep. And Walter made choices too. Putting money away since I was born, because my father asked him to, answering a call at midnight and being in his car 9 minutes later, sitting in a hospital waiting room alone until he knew I was stable, never once making me feel like any of it was a burden. Those were small choices too, in their own way. Made quietly, made consistently, over 14 years. That's what I keep coming back to. Not the dramatic moments, not the crash, not the courtroom documents, not the settlement. The small repeated choices that nobody witnesses and nobody applauds. That's where character actually lives. Not in the big tests, in the daily ones, when it's inconvenient, when nobody's watching, when it would be perfectly easy to do nothing. I used to think I had bad luck. Grew up in the wrong house, lost my father too young, got left out of things I should have been included in. And maybe some of that's true, but the older I get, the more I think luck isn't really the right word. What I had was Walter. And Walter wasn't luck. He was a choice my father made before he died, and a promise Walter kept every single day for 14 years without ever asking for recognition. That's intelligence of a different kind. Not the kind you measure in grades or test scores. The kind that understands what actually matters and acts accordingly. Even when acting is hard, even when the rain is coming down at midnight and you're 78 years old and the drive is 43 miles each way. I think about the person I was before all this happened. Quiet, careful, wanting as little as possible from people who couldn't give it. That version of me was surviving. There's nothing wrong with surviving. But surviving isn't the same as building something. It took the worst night of my life to show me the difference. And it took Walter to show me that building something is possible. That you can decide at any point that the life in front of you is worth the effort of constructing it properly. I'm not going to tell you that everything worked out perfectly. Life doesn't do that. But I'm 31, I have work I'm proud of, I have people I trust, and I have a grandfather who drove through the rain at midnight because I was his, and he was going to make sure I knew it. That's enough. That's more than enough. If there's anything I'd want you to take from this, it's simple. The people who show up quietly, consistently, without being asked, those are the ones worth holding on to. And the choices you make when no one is watching, when it's inconvenient, when it costs you something, those are the ones that define what kind of person you actually are. Renata's choices defined her too, just in a different direction.